So one theme that I have talked about is how in our modern world, there's an unevenness in the allowance we have to share information. What do I mean? I mean in this world where people so quickly make a man an offender for the word, just as prophesied many years ago in Isaiah, you're not allowed to bring up facts unless it serves the current social purpose. In other words, the truth is filtered through what we used to call political correctness, but what has become a much more complex map of what people are okay with hearing. The status quo, the model of reality that we are allowed to recognize and publicly discuss. So I want to share just one example of that. This inconsistency is the theme. Inconsistency of what we're allowed, the context in which we're allowed to bring up what are true facts. Okay? Now this one, I wish I had come across, because I don't go searching for these things. I just see them in the feed. And the feed for X is pretty open-ended. You just see random stuff. I'm sure it's seasoned somehow with what you have looked at in the past, but it's pretty broad. So that's helpful. You get to see a lot of ideas and get a good idea of what is going on out there in the broader world. But this post is obviously, it's about pregnancy. And what this lady says, whose name is Becky the Chicken, when looking for a wife, you have to pick the smartest woman you can find because we get dumber with every baby we make. And she's responding to a lady who said, I think my least favorite pregnancy symptom is the one where you drop like 50 IQ points. And one of the themes we see with this is that people are more inclined to tell the truth when they're joking around, especially using self-deprecating humor. And I'm sure that both of these ladies are exaggerating quite a bit. I mean, if you really dropped 50 IQ points with a baby, you'd become a slobbering idiot very quickly, right? Because 80 is on the verge of bare minimum functionality, maybe 70, okay? But you certainly couldn't have 3 children without just becoming a blob on the ground. So, Becky the Chicken continues, if any of you men had COVID and remember the brain fog, that's what it's like. Okay, and she's still sort of joking around, whatever, you can see her saying it, with a smile on her face if she was standing here. And then one person gives a counter argument, also still in the humorous realm, of saying, I gained a bunch of executive function with one of my kids. I could suddenly beat my husband in chess and keep our entire family schedule in my head. It's insane. And while they're still sort of joking around, this is a great example of a big problem we have in the modern world, which is pretending that one counterexample represents the general situation. It's a logical fallacy called arguing the exception, as in the exception to the rule, right? So if I said, big people, I don't mean fat, I mean large framed people are stronger, and then you showed me a big person who was really weak, well, in general, it's still true that large framed people are strong compared to the general population. So that's an example of arguing the exception. There are many, many, many more. You'll see it all the time. And you'll see it in particular in demographics of the population that are known for their inability to think in general terms. So Becky the Chicken responds by saying, lucky, I can't form words half the day. Now, I'm not going to read through all of these, right? But look at the specific responses and then try to generalize them. And you're going to see this pattern everywhere, I'm telling you, with this idea of inconsistency, of disallowed information because it doesn't fit the status quo. And if you say these things, so this is a woman and she's joking around, and so she's allowed to say these things. But if you weren't joking around, and especially if you weren't a woman, you wouldn't be allowed to say these things. And we'll see she's even denigrated later on here, even in this context. Okay? So here's one response from a man who's obviously never heard this before or noticed it. They don't return after the birth. And there's some others that are disbelieving here later. But there's overwhelming support of her point from women. Here's one. My best friend when I was a young mother used to look down at her breastfeeding baby and say, I think he's sucking my neurons out with the breast milk. This one, I got mentally slower for a while too. I think my first was about 3 weeks old before my brain started perking up. Here's another one. I think my smarts did come back. I might just seem dumber because I'm so much more distracted. Here's another. My brain used to hold lyrics, stories I've read, movie quotes, and witty one-liners. Now it's full of remembering tiny hands in mine, laundry schedules, recipes I can make half asleep, etc. So this is an example of admitting the truth spun in a positive way. Now this lady's right. Those all are good things. And they're probably worth the trade-off. I'd say the child is definitely worth the trade-off, right? But this is, if you want another fantastic example of this, that also happens to be a women's issue, look at menopause and the effects of menopause. You are absolutely positively not allowed to talk about it. But if you see people talking about it, you'll see the only female scientist, as far as I'm aware, who studies this is allowed to talk about it. You'll see women who present it in a positive light, including, which I think is justified and right, ones who present it as an exchange of value that has a greater net benefit, that has a net benefit, right? That the trade-off, the cost is worth the benefit. But because you can't discuss these things openly, you can't realistically prepare people for that cost, and you can't appropriately contend with the outcomes. So what do I mean by all this? Now, we're not talking about menopause here. We're talking about having babies. But with menopause, if you pursue spouse selection and having children and choosing whether or not to have a career and choosing whether or not to go to college and all these other things, under the incorrect idea that menopause doesn't exist, and if it does exist, it's not that bad, and if it is that bad, then it's worth it under every circumstance. If you pursue it that way, you're guaranteed to make horrible decisions in your life. Horrible. And you're guaranteed to support societal patterns and policy decisions that make everything worse. Because you're living in a dream world that doesn't exist. It's a complete illusion. It's a delusion, more correctly said. Okay? So let's get back to pregnancy. What are some of the implications? So here's another arguing by the counter example, but also from a white knight. I don't know if you've heard that phrase. A white knight is someone who steps in and argues the opposite. Mostly it's men, and it's mostly to get positive female attention. So here's a guy who thinks he's standing up for his wife by arguing the exception, right? Here's a lady who's this is a more typical response when you say these sorts of things. Speak for yourself. There's another one on here that says, way to help women. Where's that? Well, way to make women look good. I'm sure this is a joke, but it just seems very condescending to women. Who cares? Is it true? The objective in life is not to make people look good. if they shouldn't look good. It's not to dress up the cost of things, to try to do a magician's trick and make it disappear. We're out here to choose the things that have the greatest net benefit. And for that, you need to actually know the cost. Right? You have to actually know the cost. So getting back to this and why it's important to get down to the truth, we live in a society that says, oh, having kids is like getting your nails done. No big deal. Yeah, you might have some inconvenience for 9 months, but as soon as a baby pops out, you just ship them off to daycare, and they're basically like dogs. You put them in the cage while you're at work, and then you come home and you pick them up out of the cage, feed them, and do all the other things that you would do normally. You want to go travel the world, is fine. Just bring along the entourage of all the, have you seen those wagons they have now for kids? That they collapse and people take them on the planes so that they have no inconvenience whatsoever in hauling their token kid around. They could just keep living their single life, or they're married without kids life. And they say, oh, you can hire women in your company. It's diversity is our strength. It's not only is it not a bad thing, it's a good thing. They will magically crank up your profits no matter what the facts of the circumstance are. No, actually, if this lady's right, then, which I'm not saying she is, like I said, I didn't go looking for this. So, but you could make this case with menopause with facts. With almost all women, there's a significant mental downturn with menopause. So if you're hiring ladies who are getting older, guess what? And you have an intellectual job, guess what? So now how did all these arguments pan out with, we have to pay men and women the same, no matter what? What's interesting is that you never hear the argument that all men should be paid the same, or all women for that matter. You know why? Because people perform jobs at different rates of productivity. And it is completely and totally possible that there are trends there that emerge demographically. And it doesn't matter if it's physical or cultural. It matters if it's there or not. Right? You can measure this. You don't have to just sort of think, oh, well, maybe it's this, maybe it's that. You can measure it. Just like they've measured the decrease in intellectual output that co-occurs with menopause and stays for life. It actually gets worse over time. But there's a significant drop and then it levels off. Okay? So, this one's funny. I was once a trad wife, but then I had a lot of kids and now I'm a tard wife. Okay, so we can laugh about it or we can cry about it, but it's true either way. Right? With a lot of these things. I'm not saying this. I've looked at no research about intelligence broadly defined and how that changes with kids, but your hormones are growing crazy. It's no surprise if that's true. For example, your eyes tend to adjust. If you're a woman and you have babies, that's why they say don't get laser eye surgery if you're planning on having kids until you're done. Because your eyes change with pregnancy. So hormones change you. Surprise. Anyway, so this is an example of information consistency and how we're not allowed by society to use the same critical thinking across the board. We're pressured to suspend that in cases where it would cause us to draw conclusions that are contrary to the status quo.